Wyoming, during the spring, the summer, wild horses run the western red desert. I saw this one wild horse that I don't know if you know much about horses, but they just carry this dignity. And there was this one the size of a Clydesdale in pure black, and he was the leader. And I was like, man, that's a handsome horse. I wish I had his hair. Long highways with nobody on them. You can drive for 2 to 3 hours straight and see like 5 people. The Bighorns, which is sort of a forgotten wilderness that Teddy Roosevelt was very fond of. The Tetons, I would say top 3 things I've ever seen in my life. Devil's Tower, fly fishing. You know, the river runs through it. And that's pretty much that area. It's grit and cowboys and old school Americana. And so we had been there about 4 years at that point in Wyoming. And when COVID hit, it was not really a big deal in Wyoming. It's a red state through and through. Everybody there is very much cowboy up, push through, move on. And so I have to confess that I indulged in a steady stream of COVID memes. I was not very humble about it either. And really nothing happened. Like, we had a few people that got a little sick. We were really only closed for like 2 months at the most. Even during that time, we started doing outdoor church. So we were back together and nothing really happened, and it blew through. So when Delta came along, the COVID memes started up again and the jokes. The board had decided to create a mask area in the church for those that wanted to wear masks, and you know how all that went. The offensiveness of not wearing one, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I kind of rolled my eyes and all right, let's create the COVID area. Ironically, that's what got me COVID, was creating the COVID area. The guys that I was doing this with had been to a birthday party just a couple days beforehand where the birthday guy, it wasn't a boy, he was the one that blew out the candles and didn't know he had COVID. And now 30 of us had it. It was a super spreader. It happened and several of us landed in the hospital. Unfortunately, I was the one that got it the worst. Well, twice, I should say. The first time I went, I got better. So I went home, and then it knocked me on my butt. I was telling my wife, I don't think I'm going to make it, honey, and completely out of my mind. If you want to know, my oxygen sats were in the high 50s, low 60s. So I would just sit and cough and cough and cough, and we used everything we possibly could to try and feel better. And if you don't know what O2 stats should be, they should be 95 and up. So here I'm at 60, which is bordering on death and organ failure. Of course, my mind was as sharp as could be when my wife's like, you need to go to the hospital and to the ER. No, I'm fine. And then we argued and, oh, I'm going to call the paramedics, and oh, that costs too much money. I'll just go ahead and get dressed and you can drive me there. And then 5 minutes later, change my mind. Anyway, so she went behind my back, called the ambulance that showed up and pretty much saved my life. And so I ended up in the hospital for a month. I spent almost a week in intensive care. Obviously, I made it through. So just to give you an idea of how bad this was, I was on maximum pressure, maximum oxygen for 2 weeks straight. I had basically COVID pneumonia. And with this, you can't just give it antibiotics because it's viral. So there's nothing you can do to get rid of it. I basically had 2 little grapefruit areas in my lungs that were still open. for 2 months. Just, I kind of liken it to taking a plastic bag and putting it over your head and popping a pinhole and trying to breathe through that for 2 months straight. And so my response to all this was not a response of faith, like, oh, God is so good and I'm here trusting you, Lord. My experience was fear and anxiety. Because as I told you last week, I came from the world and I swung from a crazy drug addict, homeless kid to a crazy, fanatical, religious nut. It took me 12 years to learn the gospel and begin to find peace and to process that in my life and to begin to accept that here. But it's all another thing to accept it here. Because you know it's true, but it's another thing when you're dying and you still got sin in your life. You've been fighting, let's be honest, Adventist history for a while because we, 1888 and last generation theology and perfection doctrine and legalism and, the questions on doctrine and Ford and Walter Ray and there's all these baggages with the church when it comes to how you are saved, right? And learning the gospel of the new covenant took me a really long time, but it's also terrifying because many times you feel like you're standing out there on an island by yourself and everyone thinks you're crazy. And so when I was young, I didn't have really a fear of death for most of my life. There's a story when I was about 10 years old. I was out playing and had the smart idea. There's this bridge that went over the river where I lived in northern Minnesota. If you know anything about that area, this is where you get iron ore from. The rock and the bedrock there is iron. It's hard, solid, sharp bedrock. And the water in the river is about this deep, and the rocks that it trickled through are about this big. I had the smart idea, if you think of a I-beam kind of concrete bridge, that I was going to shimmy across from one side to the other on that little section of the I-beam at the bottom. And so here I am, 10 years old, shuffling across. It's probably only about as wide as my foot. There's nothing behind me for probably 20, 30 feet. There's a cliff there. And then straight down for about 20 some odd feet to the stone. I get about a third of the way out. I don't know what I did. I breathed or something, but and I went past the point of no return, where you know that your balance is done, it's over. And my little life flashed before my eyes, just like they say every second of my life. I said, wow, this is how I die. Okay. I was just waiting to die. And that just happened like all of a sudden, I was flat against the wall. And I'm like, huh? There was no coming back from that. Something behind stabilized me because I had a life still to live and I had things to do for God. And so I'm like, okay, I think I'm getting off here. I didn't do that again. But this time was different. I was an adult, and adults know better, right? That's the problem with when we know things, but we don't know how to actually experience them. We're supposed to live them, but we have no idea how. And so here I was stepping out into the pitch black nothingness of death, based only on the promises of mercy from God for sinners. That's all I had. You either save me or I'm lost. And so with my condition worsening at that point, I was in ICU, and I finally woke up, and I could not sense the presence of God there. So I cried out with all my heart, as loud as I could. I'm sure the nurses thought I was crazy. God, where are you? I need you here. You have to be here. I need to know if I'm saved. I need you to be with me right now. I'm dying. And through barely breathing and suffocating, attack after attack, help me, Jesus. Help me. You see, this is the thing about COVID. When you can't breathe and then you start coughing, what happens? Your O2 goes down more. And that makes you cough more. And your O2 goes down. You have to get in control of your mind and be like, stop, or you're going to die. And in that, I'm crying out to Christ to save me. And he came. About an hour after I did that, I could sense his presence in the room. I could sense the Spirit there with me. He spoke to me and he said, Shane, you're not going to die. But I'm not going to pull the punch. You're going to drink this, every last drop of this cup to its finish. And I said, Lord, I don't care. I don't care if I die right now. I just need to know you're here. That's what's important to me. I said, your will be done, whatever you want. Just thank you for being here. And would you please stay with me here tonight? And he did. You see, in this moment, what was so important to me was that he had not abandoned me in my darkest hour. I was at peace. I was dying, and I had peace. Frankly, when I got back and I turned on the news, I was like, did you have to bring me back? But he was there because that's all that ever mattered. God hears our prayers for mercy. When we cry out to him, he hears us. He knows each and every single one of us by name. Even when the answer may not be what you want it to be, he still is there. He didn't abandon me like my father did. He was there. And when I woke the next morning, God showed me this in Psalm 116. You can turn with me there if you'd like. So if you don't mind, I wrote a book on the Psalms, and I'm going to read it from here because this is kind of where it happened. It's a flip of perspective. And this is what he shared with me. This is God speaking now. You love me because I have heard your voice. I have heard your prayer for mercy because I have bent down to listen to you when you decided to pray to me as long as you lived. For death entangled you in its ropes. The anguish of the grave closed in on you, and you were overcome by anxiety and sorrow. It's exactly what I was dealing with at my death, was fear and anxiety. Then you called on my name. I beg you, Lord, deliver my soul. I am gracious and loving. I, your God, am full of compassion. I protect the naive. I put that word in there. What does the original say there in verse 5? I protect the simple-hearted. Yeah, the dumb. The simple. The naive. He protects us. So when you were brought low, I saved you. Let your soul be at rest, for I have been good to you. I have delivered your soul from death your eyes from tears and your feet from stumbling, all so that you can walk in my presence in the land of the living. That's all that I cared about, is that my soul was delivered. I didn't care about my life anymore. You trusted me when in your anxiety you said, I am deeply troubled, Lord. Now you wonder, how can I repay the Lord for all his goodness? How do you do it? Verse 13, by lifting up the cup of salvation and giving glory to my name, by fulfilling your vows to me in the presence of all my people. For the death of my faithful servants is deeply precious to me. Truly, you are my servant, and you serve me just as your mother did, and so I freed you from the chains of death. Therefore, give the sacrifice of thankfulness when you call upon my name. Fulfill what you have committed to me, the Lord, in the presence of all my people, in the courts of my house, in the midst of Jerusalem. Give a testimony of praise. So here I am lifting up the cup of salvation to you, sharing his goodness with you. Word for word, he answered my prayer. And he will do that for you as well when you trust him, regardless of the context. Can you trust God when your prayers are not answered? Can you trust God when your life is falling apart? Can you trust God when the bills are due? And do you still trust God when you're doing well? That's the reason that this was so hard for me, is because when I took my walls down from my childhood abuse to open up to Jesus, and then the church wounded me and violated my spirit and abandoned me, and all kinds of issues that go around legalism. In the same way, and my walls went back up, except this time my walls were towards God, not just people. It was really hard for me to trust God again, because it seemed like every time I tried to open my heart up, the rug would get pulled out under me somehow, or some critic would come along and have negative, satanic, spiritual, discouraging things to say to me, to put me into a place of hopelessness, that I'm not good enough, that God doesn't love me unless. And that's a lie from the devil. That's not the gospel, that's the flesh. So many of us, we love the Lord, and so we want to do his will in our life, and what do? We create Ishmaels by taking it into our own control to produce fruit. And what does that fruit cause? It causes the Middle East. Think about it. Abraham's decision to this day is still screwing up the world. When we try to do spirituality on our own, it brings more destruction than had we just lived out in the world in the first place. The flesh loves to be spiritual in the same way that the flesh loves to be pagan and hedonistic. Our flesh loves commitment and self-discipline. I mean, just look at Buddhism. Buddhism is dedicated, deep, beautiful, deep wisdom principles, but it's absolutely dedicated to earning their way into heaven. And I want to make a point here about last generation theology. I said this last week. If you're not perfect, you won't be saved. But if you say you're perfect, you're not saved. So you can never be saved. Do you understand the logic? Maybe you'll be saved. You'll find out, though, when the fire comes. I hate to tell you, that's not Jesus and the gospel. That's Islam. That's an Islamic God, where you have to be You have to attain these places in life to be good enough to have God accept you into his kingdom. It's not Christianity. I should say it is Christianity, but it's not the Bible. There's plenty of Christians that do the same thing. You see, we need the miracle of a life that comes only from God to create birth in a dead womb, to make life out of nothing. I have nothing to offer God. If you don't save me, I won't be saved. And God's like, yeah, now we can get started. About time. Only took you 20 years, Shane. God's greatest skill is making beautiful things out of the messes that people make. And so gratitude became the basis of my salvation. You know how immoral it was to cut people off from their dying loved ones? Yeah? It's immoral. If I want to die with my wife, let me. And I'm not blaming the people in the hospitals because they had to follow the rules of the state. But we had the rule of the state, and it was what it was. So my cousin, who is very good at expletives, she went and found the direct phone number to the CEO of the hospital. And man, just laid into him. Poor guy. David, if you're watching this, I'll make sure she never calls you. But anyways, she did it in a fairly constructive way, just with lots of color. And he actually changed the rules around visitation and allowed my wife and mom to start coming in. It was pretty powerful. My wife and my mom showing up there day after day after day after day, all day long, while I laid in a chair and couldn't even go to the bathroom. Like I was that bad. I mean, I couldn't even stand up. About halfway through, we had a Zoom meeting, an anointing. They allowed a retired pastor to come in and do an anointing. And then my wife was there. Then we did Zoom, and we had like 40 people on there all praying for me. And that's when I started to get better. My oxygen levels on the machines started going down. The pressure started going down. My lungs started working better. My body started working again. The kids afterwards, after I got out, surprised me with a Faith Over Fear banner in the church school there. You have to understand, for them, my living was just as powerful as it was for me. Because I love those kids. We were so close, and it would have been devastating to them if I had died. I want to share a miracle that happened. It was 2 months of not being able to breathe. I was the perfect patient because my mom's a nurse. I know exactly what it's like to work in healthcare. So I was a very, click, 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 click. I did not do that. I was an easy patient. I took my pills. I was doing the proning and the side, and I was really religious and faithful with it. I was going to get better. So I'm at home, and all of a sudden I go into one of those coughing spasms, and it's the middle of the night. I can't stop coughing for like an hour at least straight. And my wife has to work at 4 a.m., and I'm just feeling terrible for her. She's doing everything she can to try and help me. She goes into the kitchen to make some tea, and I was laying on my side, and all of a sudden I felt a presence in the room, like a heavenly presence. And it moved over to my side of the bed, reached out his hand and touched my lung. And it went, like for real. Like right in here, there's this little pocket right here that just boop, opened up for the first time in 2 months. And I pretended to grab his hand. And I said, thank you, thank you, thank you. From that point forward, my lower lungs cleared. If you saw my x-ray, it was literally, the whole thing was just that ghostly white color, if you've ever seen a x-ray of COVID. The doctor afterwards, my primary physician, he looked at my before and after. He said, wow, I've never seen it this bad in someone that isn't dead. I'm like, okay, thanks. Thanks, I guess. It took 4 months to get back on my feet. I did 6 months with a personal trainer at the Y that got my muscle tone. And 13 months on oxygen. I never got off oxygen. My O2 stats never went above 93. They were 79 to 93 the last 13 months prior to coming back to sea level. We lived at 6,000 feet, you have to understand. And by the way, my sats now are, my bottom is 93 and my top is 97. So praise God for that. There's just a couple last points I want to make today about the reason God had me drink this cup to its last. And he did. I've felt every bit. I still can't go. So frustrating not being at the ocean and you can't really smell it. You know, I can if it's like real up close and stuff. Oh man, I hate this COVID. The epiphany is that when you are dying, the illusions of this world, they fade away. Life becomes superfluous like a vapor, and there is nothing left. All of the things that you've achieved, all of the adventures, all the things you did do, all the things you regret not doing, all of the tower of achievements, it all means nothing to you. Even the people you love, you lose all of them too in death. Everything is gone. And so if you don't have the Lord, you literally have nothing. Like when you step out into the darkness, there is nothing. But if you have the Lord, you have everything. Every adventure, every desire, every longing, the people you loved, it's all given back to you in heaven. I can finally write a symphony and I'll learn to play every single instrument. And if I, for whatever reason, do not someday get a sailboat, I will learn to sail in heaven. And the winds are always going to go the right direction. When you have the Lord, you still have everything. And so if you're overwhelmed by this crazy talk about God speaking and angels showing up, don't you dare think less of your own walk with God. Everyone has their own way of speaking with God. Everybody. Some of us do it through a walk on the beach, some through listening to the wind or the moon or the, a quiet nature, whatever. Some of us just through reading his word. That's our way that God speaks to us. I mean, obviously all of us through the word, but each of us, God knows every single one of us. And so in closing, I want to share this is the Spirit showed me one last message during this whole experience from a revivalist by the name of Dennis Reeder. He said, God isn't just wanting us to hear his voice through our spiritual gifts. He wants us to spend time in his heart. This one took me a bit. I'm going to reread it to you. God isn't just wanting us to hear his voice through our spiritual gifts, through our spiritual experiences. He wants us to spend time in his heart. You see, God isn't interested in us being spiritual as much as he is in us knowing him. We're all looking for these spiritual experiences. I mean, they're great. I'm super excited when miracles happen, no question. I love it when the Lord speaks. It's exciting. But that's not the point. The point is knowing God. Knowing that he's a good God and that He loves you and He cares about you and He wants to redeem you. Exodus 33, verse 18. Moses said, "Please let me see your glory." He wants to see God. Let me see your glory. And what did he do? He had his goodness pass in front of him. You see, the glory of the Lord is His goodness, His love for you, His care for you, His discipline for you, not as a psychopathic, angry dad, but as a loving father trying to protect you from stepping out into the street of moving cars. God cares about you. His glory, His character, righteousness, His love, all of it is His goodness. And the question is do we actually really believe He's good? It's hard to do that when we're trying to earn our way into heaven. It isn't the miracles. It isn't in the gifts. It isn't in material success. And it certainly isn't in political solutions. The only safe place at the end of life is the cleft of the rock, listening to His voice, looking upon His goodness as He passes us by. And in His presence, we find rest.